I wanted to talk today a bit about Lazarus, because Lazarus is a character who, after the scriptures, goes on to do things that perhaps aren't very well known amongst Christendom. In the Orthodox Church, it's a part of the tradition, but I just found it very interesting and edifying. And so, after the events of the gospel, what happens to Lazarus is he goes on to become a bishop. He becomes the bishop of the Greek island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean Sea. And so Cyprus today is, this haven of banking, of materialism, of wealth, of power, of isolated, difficult to attain land. But at one point in the ancient world, not long after Christ, it was Lazarus who arose from the dead, who was the presiding bishop over that land and the spiritual authority as a part of the early Christian church. And yes, there were authorities in the early Christian church and formal structures such as bishops and deacons and presbyters. Timothy was made the episcopon, a formal position of the church, and Paul and I believe Clement of Rome, though I could be confusing that with Clement of Alexandria, instructed followers to obey Timothy in what he said because of his office of the episcopon. And so Lazarus was one of these figures of the early church who was part of the formal church organization. And there was also a figure called Polycarp, who was the last of those who were formally instructed by the apostles. Polycarp was the student of John the Evangelist, who, according to tradition and early records, wrote the book of Revelation on Patmos in the cave of the Revelation, in a dark cave around, whatever it is, somewhere in 60 to 90 AD, because John lived to be quite old. In the Gospel of John, if that is dated to around 90 AD, John lived to be about 100 years old. He was an older guy. And so his student, Polycarp, became the bishop of Smyrna. And so there's just this very interesting web of early church organization that has assembled after the Gospels, and Lazarus is part of it. And Lazarus is a figure who, if you don't know this, just seems like he's only in the Gospels and then doesn't go on to do anything afterward. But in fact, he does. He goes on to convey the Eucharist, to remit sins. He is in the office of the church. And there's a very interesting story about Lazarus that I find compelling, where, he sees, I believe it's a young child with a clay pot, and the child destroys the pot. And Lazarus was known to never smile, never be happy. He was kind of a curmudgeon because he had been raised from the dead and was still living. There's a certain fatigue in Lazarus that I find very, very interesting, where even after he's been arisen and become a bishop, he doesn't have that much joy in this life, perhaps because he's tasted of the life to come. And so he knows what's coming to such an extent that it's hard for him to be here. It's hard for him to be present in the world. And so he sees this child messing around with a clay pot, and he smiles for the first time in years. He finally grins and breaks his downcast countenance. And he says, the clay destroys the clay. The clay messes with the clay. So we are God's clay. We are made of clay. And we think that we have the right also to destroy clay. And it's just very funny that we don't realize how we're all in the hands of God, whether they're the clay pot or we are ourselves. And of course that ties into the book of Jonah as well, where God essentially admonishes Jonah at the end of the story, when Jonah is all miserable and sad and downcast and self-important. And God tells him, look, you didn't make any of this, that he gets shade under a tree, I believe a fig tree, and the tree is destroyed and taken down, and Jonah is all upset about it. And God says, look, you didn't make that tree grow, I did. Why are you sad that it's now been taken away? And that's the final line of the book of Jonah. Is Jonah being admonished for his despair at something he didn't build being taken away, because God built it, because God caused it to grow. And it's like that with all things at their deepest root, that God caused it to grow or not. And so the despondency of Jonah is a good instruction there. But this is about Lazarus primarily, and Lazarus was a figure who was very compelling because of his place in the early church as a bishop and his role in being the bishop of that island at a time where Christianity was very new, and having tasted of death and come back to life, he was not yet the firstborn of the dead, that is Christ, because Christ is resurrected unto heaven, unto the final place. Lazarus is only resurrected back to being here. And that's a very interesting fate. Perhaps a very tragic fate. Perhaps it's why he couldn't smile. But there's a joy in it too. Because when you think about it, in baptism, when the old man is killed and we put on Christ like a garment, those who are put on baptism put on Christ, there is a certain death that unfolds there. There is a death to the world, and then we are asked to continue living in the world. Even though we're dead to the world, we keep living in the world. We're asked to share, in some degree, in the lot of Lazarus. We're asked to take on that yoke, where you've died to the world, and yet you're back in the world. We're right back at it. It's like that movie. It's like that VHS. We're back, a dinosaur story. Welcome back, bro. Welcome back. So you're dead to the world, but you're living in the world. We are in the world, but not of it. Just like Moby Dick in the depths of the sea. In the world, but not of it. It's a very inherently ascetic sort of thing. So, if you feel interested in Lazarus, you can look up a lot of these stories online. There's a great pamphlet, kind of short book called The Door to Paradise, which goes over a bit of this in the early church history. Get The Door to Paradise if you can. I believe it's probably free online as a PDF or orderable online. That's very good for learning a bit about Lazarus. And we're all, in a sense, Lazarus, because we die and we reawaken every single night. I mean, you can't take these things too far. They do just go into everything, because if Christ wasn't present in everything, it wouldn't be true. But it is true, because when you go to sleep every night, you die to yourself and you're reborn the next day in yourself. You are called once again to face it all, despite having gone away from it and gone somewhere else. Now you're back. We're back every morning. And that's why you pray every morning and pray every night, because it is a continual resurrection built into the very structure of being. And this is wild, this is transformative, this is too much for anyone to bear, but it's also just enough to bear. So, God bless you, and I hope this was interesting stuff. I hope this was informative.